The deathly silence that fell over the municipal theater when Helen stepped onto the stage lasted exactly 17 seconds, long enough for 400 people to witness the rebirth of a soul that had been lost for 15 years. But to understand how this 52-year-old woman, dressed in a faded cleaning uniform, ended up there on that September night, we need to go back to the beginning of that fateful day when it all started with a humiliation she never imagined could exist. It was Tuesday, 6 in the morning, and Helen was pushing her cleaning cart through the still empty corridors of the municipal theater. The worn heels of her shoes echoed against the marble floor as she observed the posters for the opera season decorating the walls. Each face printed there was a ghost of what she had once dreamed of being. Her calloused fingers unconsciously caressed her throat, where once resided a voice capable of making angels weep. "Helen, where have you been?" Marta's sharp voice cut through the morning air like a knife. "The opera's dress rehearsal starts in 2 hours, and this place is a mess." Helen lowered her head, swallowing the words she wanted to say. 15 years of silence had taught her that it was better not to respond. She simply picked up her cleaning supplies and headed to the main stage, where the sets for the production of La Traviata awaited her attention. The stage was immense, majestic, a universe of possibilities she knew intimately, but now only as the person responsible for keeping it clean. Helen began to mop the floor, moving among the empty seats in the audience like a shadow. That's when the memories always came, uncontrollable as tides. Asterisk, 1997. The same stage, but she was wearing a long navy blue dress, her hair elegantly coiled. The orchestra was tuning their instruments as she warmed up her voice backstage. It was her debut as Violetta in La Traviata, the role she had studied for 3 years at the conservatory. Her heart beat like a war drum, but when she stepped onto the stage and the first notes escaped her throat, the entire world disappeared. There was only her, the music, and 400 people mesmerized by her voice. Asterisk, the next morning's newspaper review described her as a stunning revelation, a heavenly voice promising to revolutionize American opera. Helen had kept that clipping like a treasure, taping it to the mirror in the room where she practiced daily. "Hey, Helen," the voice of the artistic director Richard Miller brought her back to the present. He was a stylish man in his 40s, always impeccably dressed and with an air of superiority he delighted in displaying. "Could you clean a little faster? The artists will be arriving soon, and I don't want them to see this place like this." Helen nodded silently, speeding up her movements. Richard watched her for a moment, with that condescending smile she knew so well. "You know, Helen," he continued, sitting in one of the front row seats, "sometimes I think you've worked here for so long, never had the desire to do something else with your life, some dream that fell by the wayside." The question hit Helen like a punch to the stomach. She stopped mopping and looked at him, trying to decipher whether there was malice or genuine curiosity in his words. Helen began, but her voice came out hoarse, broken from disuse. "I always loved music." Richard laughed, a sound that echoed through the empty theater like a cruel cackle. "Oh sure, everyone loves music, right? But it's one thing to love it, another to have real talent. Opera, for example, it's for special people, with rare gifts. It's not for everyone." Helen felt her face flush. There was something in the way he said anyone that made it clear he was referring to her. She returned to her work, trying to ignore the words that hammered in her head. Asterisk, 2003, the phone call that changed everything. The doctor's voice was gentle, but implacable. "I'm so sorry, Helen. The vocal nodule is very serious. You will need surgery immediately, and even then, I can't guarantee your voice will return to what it was before." Asterisk, she had spent 6 months in total silence after the operation. 6 months looking in the mirror and trying to make any sound at all. When she finally managed to speak again, her voice was a distant shadow of what it once was. The high notes were gone, replaced by a constant hoarseness. The conservatory offered her a position as a teaching assistant, but Helen couldn't bear being surrounded by young, promising voices when her own had died. That's how, at 37, she traded the stage for the service corridors. Better to clean the theater than never be able to be in it again, she thought at the time. At least she could still hear music, even if it was only as a ghost wandering through the wings. "Helen, are you finished there?" Marta appeared on stage, carrying a stack of playbills. The artists are arriving. The dress rehearsal is about to begin. Helen quickly gathered her materials, but as she headed for the side exit, she heard a heated argument coming from backstage. How is it that she's not coming? Rodrigo's irritated voice echoed through the corridors. The show is tonight. I'm sorry, maestro, replied the nervous voice of the production assistant. Carla woke up voiceless. Acute pharyngitis. The doctor said she can't even whisper. Helen stopped in the middle of the corridor, her heart pounding. Carla Montenegro was the lead soprano, the Violetta in this production of La Traviata. Without her, there would be no show. And the understudies? Rodrigo asked, but his voice already carried the answer. Julia is in Europe, and Marina hurt her throat yesterday in rehearsal. We don't have anyone who knows the role completely. Helen closed her eyes. She knew every note, every movement, every breath of that role. She had been Violetta hundreds of times in the dreams that still visited her sleepless nights. We're going to have to cancel, Richard said, defeated. Notify the audience. Refund the tickets. It'll be a disaster. Cancel. A third voice joined the conversation. It was Maestro Giuseppe, the 70-year-old Italian conductor who led the orchestra. Richard, you can't cancel a premiere. There are sponsors in the audience tonight, important critics. That would be professional suicide. So what do you suggest, Giuseppe? That I pull a soprano out of a hat? Helen felt her legs tremble. For 15 years, she had imagined this moment, not the despair of others, but the possibility of returning to sing. Even knowing her voice wasn't the same, even knowing it would be a gigantic risk, something inside her screamed for her to speak up. But she didn't. Instead, she turned to leave discreetly, when she bumped into a cleaning cart, knocking over a bottle of detergent that shattered on the floor with a deafening crash. Who's there? Richard appeared in the hallway, seeing Helen crouching, picking up the shards of glass. Helen, what are you doing here? Sorry, Richard, I was finishing cleaning, and I overheard. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's okay, but now you'll have to know, there's no show tonight. Our leading soprano got sick, and I know the role. The words slipped out of Helen's mouth before she could control them. Richard looked at her, as if she had spoken in an alien language. What was that? Helen slowly stood up, feeling the world spin around her. I said I know Violetta's role, every aria, every movement, every cue. Richard started to laugh, but stopped when he saw the seriousness on Helen's face. Helen, are you telling me you can sing opera? I was a soprano. Helen said, and her voice sounded firmer than it had in 15 years. I studied at the conservatory. I played Violetta on this very stage, in 1997. The ensuing silence was broken by the arrival of Maestro Giuseppe, who looked at Helen with curiosity. Helen Vasconcelos? He asked, frowning. I remember that name. You sang in the 97 season, didn't you? I was in the audience that night. Your voice was extraordinary. Helen felt her eyes fill with tears. It was, she whispered, but it isn't anymore. I had vocal problems. I had surgery. My voice changed. Richard shook his head, still incredulous. Then why do you work as a cleaner? Why didn't you ever say anything? Because sometimes it's easier to be invisible than to face what we've lost, Helen replied, looking directly into his eyes. Giuseppe approached, studying Helen's face intently. Helen, can you still sing? Not like before. My voice is different. Different doesn't mean worse, the maestro said gently. Sometimes it means deeper, truer. Can you try a few notes for me? Helen looked around. Richard watched her skeptically. Some production members had approached to see what was happening. All the faces reflected the same doubt. Could this middle-aged woman, dressed in a cleaning uniform, really save the premiere? Here, my dears, I need to pause our story to say something important. If you are feeling the same emotion I am telling this story, if your heart is racing like mine is right now, then you understand why it's so fundamental to share stories like this. Stories of ordinary people who find the courage to rediscover who they really are. If this narrative is touching you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, because you deserve more stories like this. Stories that remind us that it's never too late to shine again. Do it now, because what's about to happen to Helen will show why these stories of overcoming are exactly what the world needs to hear. Helen closed her eyes and took a deep breath. After 15 years of silence, it was time to discover what remained of her voice. Libium ne liate calici, she began, singing one of the best-known arias from La Traviata. Her voice was shaky at first, clearly out of shape, but there was something there, an emotional quality, a depth that hadn't existed before. The first notes were hesitant, but as Helen continued, something magical began to happen. Her voice, though different, carried a new strength, the strength of someone who had lost everything and found a way to continue. It was no longer the crystalline voice of a young soprano, but the mature voice of a woman who knew sorrow and yet chose to sing. When she finished, the silence in the hallway was deafening. Giuseppe was the first to speak, and there were tears in his eyes. "Helen, your voice has changed, that's true, but you haven't lost your gift. You've transformed it into something even more powerful." Richard looked at her as if he were seeing a ghost. I didn't know. "Helen, I'm sorry for the things I said." "Can you do it?" Giuseppe asked. "Can you sing Violetta tonight?" Helen felt a terrible fear take hold of her. 15 years away from the stage, 15 years of silence, and now they wanted her to sing for 400 people? "I don't know if I can. It's been so long." "Fear is natural," Giuseppe said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "But Helen, I heard your voice. It's different, more mature, but it's still there, and more importantly, you know this role not only technically, but emotionally. Violetta is a woman who faces loss, who fights against fate, who better than you to interpret her." Helen looked around. All eyes were on her, waiting for an answer. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't invisible. "I'll need a few hours to warm up my voice, to remember the movements." "You have the whole day," Richard said, and there was a humility in his voice that hadn't been there before. "Helen, I'd like to apologize for everything, for the way I treated you, for the things I said. I didn't know, you didn't know, but that doesn't excuse how you treated me," Helen replied, but her voice didn't carry bitterness. "You only saw me as a cleaning lady, because it was easier to put me in a category than to see who I really was." The hours that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Helen was taken to the main dressing room, where she received emergency vocal care, a costume fitting, and began to rehearse the role with the rehearsal pianist. Every movement came back naturally, as if she had rehearsed yesterday. Her voice, though still unsure, gained strength with each passage. At 6 in the evening, an hour before the performance, Helen was in her dressing room, putting on makeup when Marta appeared in the doorway. "Helen, can I come in?" The two women looked at each other in the mirror. Marta seemed uncomfortable, nervously fidgeting with her hands. "I came to apologize," Marta said finally. "For all these years, I knew you were different from the other employees. There was something about you, but I chose to ignore it. It was easier to have you as a subordinate than to recognize that maybe you were superior to me in many ways." Helen stopped applying lipstick and turned to look Marta directly in the eyes. "You know, Marta, for a long time I thought the problem was you not seeing me. But the truth is, I had stopped seeing myself. I hid so much from my own history that I forgot who I was. And now, how do you feel?" Helen smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given in years. Terrified, but alive. At 7 o'clock, the Municipal Theater was packed. News that a former soprano would be replacing Carla had spread, but no one knew exactly who she was. Murmurs in the audience spoke of a mystery artist coming out of retirement for a single night. Backstage, Helen tried to control her breathing. Violetta's dress was perfect, her makeup impeccable, but her hands trembled uncontrollably. "Helen," Giuseppe's voice reassured her. "Are you ready? I don't know if we're ever truly ready to face our greatest fear. Maybe that's exactly the definition of courage, doing what we never feel completely ready for." The curtains opened, and Helen walked to center stage. The silence of the audience was absolute. 400 people, trying to understand who this mature woman with graying hair was, occupying the place where a young star should be. For 17 seconds, Helen stood motionless in the center of the stage, looking at the audience. In their minds, she could almost hear their thoughts. Who is she? Why is she dressed as Violetta? Where is the real soprano? And then something extraordinary happened. Helen opened her mouth and began to sing. Her voice filled the theater like a wave of pure emotion. It wasn't the technically perfect voice of 1997 anymore. It was something far more powerful. It was the voice of a woman who had lost everything, who had hidden herself for 15 years, who had been invisible and underestimated, and who was now returning to claim her place in the world. Each note carried the pain of the silent years, but also the strength of someone who had chosen not to give up. When she reached the famous solo Addio del Passato, her interpretation was so visceral, so true, that there wasn't a person in the audience who wasn't completely mesmerized. Helen wasn't just singing about Violetta, she was singing about herself, about the woman who had died at 37 and who was now reborn at 52, about the pain of losing our identity and the courage to rebuild it. Throughout the 3 acts of the opera, Helen was completely transformed. Each aria was sung with an emotional depth that left the audience in tears. Richard, watching from backstage, couldn't believe that this was the same woman he had humiliated that morning. At the end of the performance, when the curtains closed for the last time, the theater erupted in applause that lasted 15 minutes. The audience rose to its feet in a standing ovation, shouting "Bravo, brava," while Helen, still in shock, received flowers on stage. But the most touching moment came when she went to the microphone to speak to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Helen said, her voice still strong after 3 hours of performance. "My name is Helen Vasconcelos. Many of you don't know me, but I've worked in this theater for 15 years, not as an artist, but as a cleaning lady." A murmur ran through the audience. "This morning, I was still invisible. I was just another person you would pass on the street without noticing. But tonight you reminded me of something I had forgotten, that no matter how many years pass, no matter how many times life knocks us down, we can always choose to get up and shine again." Tears flowed freely down Helen's face as she continued. "I dedicate this performance to everyone who has forgotten who they really are, to everyone who has become invisible to their own eyes. It's never too late to return home, and our home is always the place where our gifts can flourish." In the days that followed, Helen's story traveled the world. International newspapers told the story of the cleaning lady who became an opera star for one night. But for Helen, what mattered wasn't the sudden fame, but the rediscovery of herself. Richard resigned the following day, acknowledging he wasn't worthy of running a theater where he'd failed to recognize the talent right before his eyes. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "I've learned that the true crime isn't lacking talent, but being unable to recognize it in others." Helen was invited to sing in theaters around the world, but she chose something different. She accepted the position of artistic director of the municipal theater, with one condition, that the theater create a program to uncover hidden talents among the staff, so that no one else would have to spend 15 years being invisible. On her first day in her new role, Helen was on stage, rehearsing with young singers, when she remembered that Tuesday morning that had changed her life. Richard had asked if she had any dreams that had fallen by the wayside, and she hadn't been able to answer at the time. Now she knew the answer. Her dream wasn't just to sing, but to use her voice to help others find theirs. That September night, Helen hadn't just returned to the stage, she'd come home, and she'd learned that sometimes we need to get completely lost to discover who we truly are. That the real tragedy isn't losing our gifts, but forgetting they exist, and that it's never ever too late to shine again. The voice that rose from the ashes wasn't the same one that had been lost 15 years before. It was infinitely more powerful, because it had been tempered by pain, refined by time, and strengthened by the courage to begin again. And in the heart of the municipal theater, where the voices of generations of artists echo, Helen's story became legend, not just as the woman who saved a premiere, but as the courageous soul who reminded us that our greatest treasures are sometimes hidden in the most unexpected places, waiting only for the right moment to return to the light. When Maria opened her mouth on the stage of the Grand Theater and the first note rang out, crystal clear like a beam of light piercing the darkness, even the conductor stopped conducting, the orchestra members lowered their instruments, and the 2,000 people in the audience held their breath, knowing they were witnessing the rebirth of something the world had long lost. But to understand how this 42-year-old woman, wearing a simple black dress borrowed from her neighbor, got there, we need to go back 6 hours to when she was on her knees on the cold, linoleum floor of the hospital laundry room, scrubbing bloodstains from a surgeon's uniform while tears mingled with the bleach burning her eyes. "Maria, haven't you finished the north wing yet?" "Claudia," the supervisor's voice cut through the air like a knife. "The nurses are complaining about the linens being late. You need to be more efficient." Maria raised her head, feeling the familiar ache in her knees, which could no longer bear the long hours spent kneeling. Her fingers, once agile and delicate, were now rough and chapped from the chemicals. "I'm sorry, Claudia. I'm almost done. This is the 3rd time this week you've been late. If it doesn't improve, I'll have to talk to management." Claudia sighed impatiently. "I know you have personal problems, but this is work. We all have our struggles." Maria lowered her head, biting her lip to hold back the words that wanted to escape. Personal problems, as if the supervisor knew she'd lost her apartment the previous month and was now sleeping on her sister's couch with her 12-year-old daughter, Laura. As if she knew Maria woke up at 4 a.m. to get to the hospital by 5, worked until 3 p.m., and then rushed to her part-time job cleaning offices until 9 p.m. As if she knew that 15 years ago, Maria had been one of the most promising sopranos at the conservatory, until life forced her to choose between her dreams and survival. "I understand, Claudia. It won't happen again." When the supervisor walked away, Maria returned to her work, but her hands trembled, not from fatigue. She had grown accustomed to fatigue. They trembled with a dull rage that was brewing in her chest like a silent storm. As she scrubbed another stained sheet, her mind drifted to the conversation she'd had with Laura the night before. "Mom, we had a choir performance at school today," Laura had said, stirring the instant ramen that was their dinner for the 4th time that week. "The teacher asked if you wanted to join the parents' choir. I told her you worked too much." Maria felt her heart clench. "Honey, you know Mommy doesn't have time for those things right now." "I know." Laura looked down. "But sometimes I hear you singing in the shower, and your voice is so beautiful." The teacher said they need female voices. That night Maria had cried in the shower, letting the hot water wash away the tears along with the day's exhaustion. It had been so long since she'd truly sung. It had been so long since she'd forgotten who she was before becoming just another invisible woman in the hospital corridors. The flashback was interrupted by the clatter of a tray hitting the floor. Maria turned and saw Dr. Robert, one of the most respected surgeons in the hospital, kneeling, trying to gather the scattered papers. He looked exhausted, and Maria noticed that his hands were also trembling, not with anger like hers, but with sheer exhaustion. "Let me help." Maria dropped the sheet and approached, carefully collecting the documents. "Thank you." Dr. Robert looked her in the eyes for the first time in the 2 years they had worked at the same hospital. "You're from the laundry room, right? I always see you in the hallway." Maria nodded, surprised he'd noticed her. "I'm Maria." "Robert." He gave a tired smile. "Sorry about the mess. It was a particularly difficult day. I lost a patient, a girl about the age of my daughter." Something in his voice touched Maria deeply. It was the same pain she carried, different circumstances, but the same feeling of helplessness in the face of life. "I'm so sorry. You know, Maria, sometimes I wonder if I'm making a difference or just fighting the inevitable." Dr. Robert looked out the hallway window. "Medicine was my passion, but now, sometimes it just feels like survival." Maria felt an unexpected connection with this man she only knew by sight. "I understand. Sometimes life forces us to forget who we were." Dr. Robert looked at her curiously. "And who were you, Maria?" The question caught Maria off guard. It had been so long since anyone had been interested in her story, in the person who existed beyond the woman who cleaned the hallways. "I sang. I was a soprano. Before all this, sang." The doctor's eyes lit up. What an incredible coincidence. My wife is organizing a charity event for the hospital, a concert to raise funds for the new pediatric center. She's desperately looking for volunteer singer. Maria felt her blood run cold. Oh no, I don't sing anymore. It's been a long time. How long? 15 years. The answer came out as a whisper. Dr. Robert was silent for a moment, studying Maria's face. Can I tell you a secret? When I was young, I almost gave up medicine. I thought I wasn't good enough. A professor told me something I never forgot. Talent doesn't disappear, Robert. It just hibernates, waiting for the right season to bloom again. Maria felt her eyes fill with tears. But I'm not the same person anymore. I don't have the technique, the confidence. Maria, have you ever heard of muscle memory? The body remembers. The soul remembers. Dr. Robert gently placed his hand on her shoulder. The concert is 2 weeks away. If you change your mind, come find me. Sometimes, what we think we've lost forever is just waiting for the right opportunity to return. When Dr. Robert stepped away, Maria stood in the hallway, feeling something stir within her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. It was as if a long locked door was being delicately pushed open. That night, after finishing her shift at the office, Maria arrived at her sister's small apartment at 10 o'clock. Laura was doing homework at the kitchen table, and Maria's sister, Julia, was watching television in the living room. How was your day, Mom? Laura asked without looking up from her notebook. Maria sat beside her daughter, observing the brown hair that fell over her young face. Laura had inherited not only Maria's eye color, but also her artistic sensitivity. In the margins of her math notebook, the girl had drawn small musical notes. Laura, would you like me to sing again? The girl immediately looked up, her eyes shining. Seriously? Are you thinking about it? Maybe. An opportunity came up. Maria hesitated. But I'm scared. It's been so long. Laura closed her notebook and took her mother's hands. Mom, you know that song you always sang to me when I was little? Maria, I secretly recorded it on my phone once, when you were humming while cooking. I want to show you something. Laura ran to her room and returned with her phone. The audio was low, but Maria could hear her own voice, carefree and natural, singing while preparing dinner. The voice was different, more mature, perhaps richer with experience, but the essence was there. The music was there. Your voice is beautiful, Mom. It always was, and I'm sure it still is. Maria hugged her daughter, feeling a small but firm courage begin to grow. You're right. Maybe it's time to try. The next morning, Maria sought out Dr. Robert during her break. He was having coffee in the hospital cafeteria, looking less exhausted than the day before. Maria, it's good to see you. How are you? I've been thinking about our conversation. Maria took a deep breath. About the concert, I'd like to try. The doctor's face lit up. Really? That's wonderful. My wife will be thrilled. The concert is at the Grand Theater. It's a formal event, but nothing intimidating, especially because it's for an important cause. Grand Theater. Maria felt her heart quicken. It was where she had dreamed of singing when she was young. I don't know if I'm ready for something so big. Maria, may I ask you a question? What was your favorite song when you sang? Without hesitation, Maria replied, Ave Maria, by Schubert. It was the first song I learned at the conservatory. My teacher said I had a special connection with it. Perfect. It's exactly the kind of music we're looking for the concert. Classic, emotional, suitable for the event. Dr. Robert smiled. How about we start slowly? My wife can introduce you to the conductor who's organizing everything. You can do some rehearsals, see how you feel. Maria nodded, still nervous but determined. Okay, I'll try. And Maria, thank you. You have no idea how important this is, not just for the concert, but for yourself. Sometimes we need courage to rediscover who we really are. The following days were an emotional roller coaster for Maria. Between her shifts at the hospital and the office, she began attending rehearsals twice a week at the conservatory, where she had studied years ago. The conductor, a kind man named Carlos, was impressed with her voice from the first meeting. Maria, you have a naturally dramatic voice. Even after so much time without formal training, the technical foundation is still solid. Carlos adjusted his glasses as he flipped through the score. But I can tell you're holding back. There's an invisible wall between you and the music. Maria knew exactly what he was talking about. It was as if a part of her was afraid to fully surrender, afraid to be vulnerable again. How can I break down that wall? Tell me about your story. Why did you stop singing? Maria had never told the whole story to anyone, not even Laura.